Okay, we're live and I am recording. Hi, welcome. It's Wednesday. And if it's Wednesday, the world must be going crazy.
Happy Wednesday.
Happy Wednesday. This is our latest version of This Week in Higher Ed, and we hope to get some folks joining in with us. And
this is the preamble warm-up phase. We're just kind of chilling pre-officially live, right?
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. And it's funny because the last time we did this, we did Clubhouse as well, which is it worked out all right.
Yeah,
but we're not this time,
which is good because I did have a headache this morning, and when we're on more than one platform at the same time, Facebook doesn't count. Right. Zoom and Facebook at the same time is fine, but then when we added Clubhouse, it was kind of like crossing the streams in Ghostbusters. It was like, this is too many platforms. I don't know what I'm paying attention. Yeah.
Yes. And of course, we're also recording this for our amazing podcast. So
yes, which I listened to recently. That was my point. Jonathan Friedman, who was on a while back. I was going to have him on Trending in Education, which is my podcast. And as prep, I listened to the recording of this. It sounds great.
Mm-hmm. It was a great episode too. So that was my first introduction to the podcast. And so I went to listen because I'm a big fan of Jonathan and Penn America's work. So I was like, I want to see what he's up to.
Awesome.
Amazing episode.
That's funny because I was just talking to him this morning. So it's all small world.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of Friedman love here.
Yes, absolutely.
Are we at the official beginning time now, or where are we?
Yes, it's just now 12 o'clock. So. And do you want to bring us in, Mike?
I'll bring us in. I'll count us in all professional, like in 5 for a podcast editor. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to This Week in Higher Ed. Mike Palmer here, joined as always by Dr. Terri Givens.
Hi.
Terri, how you doing?
I am awesome. Actually, can I make my big announcement here, Mike?
Please, you can do whatever, Terri, you can kind of do whatever you like here. Also, Dr. Debra Mashek is joining us as well. So quickly, Debra, welcome to the show as well. We'll be talking to you more later.
Great to be here. Thank you both for having me.
Awesome. Yes. Well, let's dispense with the amenities, Terri.
Yes. So my big announcement is that I have accepted a faculty position at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, and I'll be starting that this fall. But that does not mean that Brighter Higher Ed or This Week in Higher Ed is going away. We're going to be continuing with these amazing discussions because we love them and it's a great thing to do. So I will be in the political science department and working on some diversity stuff, and it's going to be great.
In some ways, it may make this show, believe it or not, it might make this show even better, Terri, is what I was thinking. Because it's already been really interesting, but now you're leading a strategic effort in some of the topics that we talked about more in a theoretical way.
That's right.
You're now doing a little more of the hands-on work, and then sadly, we always talk about what's new and newsy, and sadly, the incidents that are on the social justice side are rearing their heads again around the police and people of color, particularly Black men, where we've been seeing more of that lately. So sadly, that lane is going to be wide open. But the nice thing is, I think it sounds like you're on the positive side of a lot of these conversations.
That's right.
And can you share any more now, or is this really?
No, I can.
Oh,
absolutely. So I mean, the interesting thing to me is that, and the reason those of you who know me know I've been at, this is my 3rd year being out of academia. I was the provost at Menlo College. I was at UT Austin before, and I really thought this might be me just going out and continuing to do the great work we've been doing, but and that will continue. But they kind of made me an offer I couldn't refuse. And, as there's a lot of efforts out there to focus on, diversity more generally. But this was the first, project I had seen where they developed a strategy around anti-Black racism. And I was just like, whoa, it's very specific. It's very targeted. There's money attached to it. And they really want me to come in and help them to not just hire Black faculty, but to work on student issues, to work on, help them with staff issues, my title will be Provost academic lead and advisor on issues of anti-Black racism. And so it's a real acknowledgement of the fact that, and obviously they have other projects around Indigenous and other minorities, but, that it's so specific and acknowledging that, there's these issues with, people from in the African diaspora more generally.
Yeah.
So that's what really attracted me, and that they made the commitment to this way back in September, long before I was even considering any of this. And the fact that they reached out to me, well, it was kind of a mutual interest, but yeah. So I think it's been a really great opportunity. Well, it will be, it hasn't started yet, but it will be a really great opportunity to test things out. And I really want to treat it like a research project, where we collect data, where we do things around this that can help us to understand what works and what doesn't.
Yeah.
So Terri, I've got to jump in here and say, I've got goosebumps hearing you talk about this, because it sounds like such a systems approach, that it's not just the idea of like, we should go do something, but actually putting the institutional weight behind it by having all of these different facets and by having the money behind it. And that's thrilling. I'm so excited for you. Congratulations.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and that was Debra, who we introduced briefly earlier. Debra, can you just catch our audience up quickly on who you are and where you come at the world of higher ed from?
Yeah, of course. And my apologies that I just I'm going to jump in.
No, it's great.
And we're going to go with this. I'm Deb Mashek, and I am the principal at Mike Consulting, and we do higher ed collaboration, so helping interinstitutional collaborations develop and prosper. And I come to you today as a former faculty member from Harvey Mudd College. So I was there for 14 years as the psychologist in the Department of Humanities, Social Sciences, and the Arts. And for those who don't know, Harvey Mudd is within the Claremont College's context. So there are literally 5 amazing institutions that are co-located on a single square mile of property. So that was where I cut my teeth on how to do interinstitutional collaboration. And then in late 2017, early 2018, I made the move from higher ed over to the nonprofit sector and was the executive director of Heterodox Academy, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit focused on increasing open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement across lines of difference in higher ed. And just recently stepped away from that position to go full time into the consulting work I had been doing kind of, on the down low, behind the scenes, on the side over the past couple of years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So lots to talk about there. I was mentioning to Terri as we were doing our intensive prep for this session that there's some interesting parallels between the work Terri's been doing, particularly at Brighter Higher Ed, and the work you've been doing since you put up your own shingle and have been a consultant helping folks within higher ed. And I think that was going to be the main place where we're trying to keep coming back to maybe each of your respective perspectives, because I think they're a little bit different, but there are some commonalities. And then your background is more on the psychology side, whereas Terri's a little more on the political science front. I do think, we should spend some time talking about, even if it is talking about how exhausted we all feel in response to the incidents of late, where and then how might higher ed navigate its response to the cultural phenomena of the day, which also include the vaccine. So we keep on talking about the vaccine and the virus and social justice, and that's been a pretty steady refrain for the last year. That it feels like a year we've been doing it. 6 months we've been doing this. However long we've been doing it. It's been a while. But I'd love to get some initial impressions, maybe more on we usually start on a more personal level too. Yeah.
But actually, Mike, it has been, a year ago, we were doing our weekly webinars about COVID and things, I mean, I don't know that we even a year ago imagined that we'd be talking about a vaccine by now.
Right,
I mean,
right.
It's amazing, but we're also talking about the fact that there's, distribution and access issues around the vaccine. And, I think it's been a just interesting kind of melange of things that have been kicking in terms of, the protests last summer and the ongoing protests and Black Lives Matter and then, COVID and this and that. And so it feels like we're just under constant assault.
Yeah. Well,
Right.
and then we have the combination of the George Floyd cases happening while an additional, like in Brooklyn Center, it's basically the same location to a large extent, same or similar police force, and another, black man dead at the hands of the police. And now, it sounds like the officer has since resigned, but I just find it, and then Debra, maybe love to get some of your perspective on this too. The amount of psychic reserves that we all have, like they're kind of depleted to the point where like you kind of want to have an authentic, empathetic, politically justified response to these things, but there's also part of me that is just wants to take a nap.
Right. I have this. We were talking in the pre-show about my love of metaphors, and one of the metaphors that I just keep coming back to is it feels kind of like we're walking on shifting sands through a blizzard to land on a moving target and maybe on a tightrope that's actually tied between two helicopters. And now somehow over this past couple of days with I don't even want to call it the new violence because it just keeps happening, but there's something about it feels like we're on not a lazy Susan, the thing that keeps going around and around, and it feels like we're both in replay but also going in slow motion. And so a lot of metaphors in there, but this idea of emotional reserves feel totally depleted. And I'm there with you.
Mm-hmm. And then folks are looking for help in higher ed, which is something that I think both of you have experience with. Terri, you in particular, I'm not sure as much, Deb, whether you've done this, but you've been delivering diversity and inclusion workshops and training. What happens when you're in the middle of that, and then stuff like this? I was
doing it.
Hold that.
Well, I was doing a training. Well, actually, we were on our webinar when January 6th happened, right?
I remember. Yep.
And then I was doing a workshop that Friday. And what happens is you just say to everybody, okay, we're throwing the syllabus out the window and let's just, let's wrap.
Yeah.
For those who are old enough to remember, let's just talk.
Yeah.
And it tends to, it becomes a much different thing because everybody has their emotions around it and you can't deny it, right? You can't just say, oh, we're going to just go on and do our, you have to acknowledge. So the number one thing is to acknowledge, don't try to paper over what's happening and to say, okay, we're going to focus on what your needs are right now. Mm-hmm. And, your need to talk about what's happening and process. And so what I've learned in those kinds of situations is that it's about processing and talking things through and having a group of people who you trust to be able to share things with. So that's what I found is most helpful in these situations. And for those who are on Clubhouse, actually, I'm going to be doing a talk on, we're going to have a discussion Friday at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern, part of my Radical Empathy Club to talk about, how do you respond? How can you take action again on these topics around police violence and so on. So.
Yeah. And the name is Dante Wright too, it's sadly you have to remember names sooner now, but hopefully, we're putting this in context in terms of when folks are listening to this. This is, within a few days of the murder of Dante Wright. Looks like it'll be manslaughter charges that are brought up because the officer is claiming that she was reaching for her pistol and grabbed her taser. Reaching for the taser. Yeah, that would have been better. Yeah. In fact, if we could, maybe that's a new training idea is get them to make the mistake in the other direction. But, and that's happening while I think it's now shifted to Derek Chauvin's defense is presenting now, which just puts everything already on edge, particularly in Minnesota. And then I think that's now spreading across the country. So what's going to happen in terms of the verdict on the Chauvin case, what's the response going to be like there, and then what will the policing be like in Minnesota in particular, but then also across the country as the temperature gets dialed back up on things that had kind of dialed back to a simmer since last summer.
Do we know when to expect a verdict? Is there a timeline given yet?
It's a good question.
I'm not sure.
I think it may depend on how long the defense, because I thought the prosecution already did.
Yes, the prosecution rested there on the defense now. So it just depends on how many witnesses and so on they decide to bring. And then of course, we don't know how long the jury will deliberate.
Right.
Yeah. But the closing arguments would be an interesting thing from what I heard, and I haven't really watched a lot of this firsthand, I heard that the prosecution did a nice job. But now, professional defense attorneys are something that are a good thing in many ways in our society, but it's difficult when you feel like they're defending someone who's guilty and they are doing a good job, but they probably are going to do an okay job with the defense, and then it's going to be left to the jury. And I certainly don't have a read on which way this will go. I'm not an expert by any stretch. It does feel like it could go either way.
I was going to point out that you mentioned January 6th, and one of the things that was so bizarre about that day is we had no idea, at least I had no idea that was coming. And all of a sudden I'm on a call, and just how the rapidity with which the emotional response bubbled up, and now something kind of different is going to unfold, because we probably will eventually have some sense of when the news will be delivered. And so kind of steeling ourselves for that. And again, knowing that even though we can prepare for the possibilities, I don't think we can perfectly predict what that personal emotional experience is going to be like for everyone, for ourselves even.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it'll depend on the charge that if he is convicted, which charges he convicted on is another element, where depending on how do people respond just to the fact that there is a guilty verdict, or does it depend on which level of charge he's found guilty of? Because I believe there's a few different ones that the jury could choose depending on whether how willful and heinous an act, I'm not sure the exact legal language there, but there are different levels of culpability and then the sentencing would be connected to that. And then in this other case, it does look like it will be a pretty straightforward manslaughter case in the Dante Wright, at least the way it's being characterized right now. But it's just crazy. Also, that's another element of the psychic depletion that I'm feeling these days, is just keeping up with all of this stuff is cognitively exhausting. Like just trying to stay current enough so that you don't say the wrong thing and you're actually aware enough, because even, I live in Brooklyn, New York here, it's pretty easy to not be as caught up as the other people around you. So there is this pressure to keep up. And then meanwhile, higher ed keeps on humming.
Well, you're not just keeping up on, legal arguments and nuance there, but you also need to be an epidemiologist to be along with everything happening with the vaccine.
Oh my God. Yeah.
We can't use that one. And higher ed's reacting, shutting down the vaccination clinics based on the news from, I don't even know, was that yesterday or today?
Yeah. Johnson & Johnson.
Yeah. He said, okay, let's put a hold on the J&J. Oh my gosh. But right. It's change over change over change.
Yes.
Yeah. And the Johnson, because maybe we could pivot into the vaccine and corona aspect of because they're kind of two sides of the same coin too, in a lot of ways. And, Terri, I'd love to get more, I know you've talked about that in the past, how these things are very closely related. If you look at the health outcomes around the pandemic, if you look at the uprising really that we've been seeing in response, not just to the pandemic. Obviously, there are these social justice issues and policing issues, but it is all as this institutional structural racism becomes more readily apparent really to everyone. how do we collectively respond? And then there's still plenty of blind spots too, because now the culture war is rearing its head again. And I think some folks are, even we talked about it previously, the Trump administration was trying to outlaw a lot of the diversity training that was happening on campuses, which is also interesting. You'll be at McGill, which is in Montreal, which will be governed more by, at least at a federal level, by the Canadian government.
Yes.
But it is a very interesting time to be thinking about these two sides of a similar coin. The vaccine reluctance is the other component of, I guess, the intersection between those two things. And that's why the Johnson & Johnson pause that we're going through right now is particularly troubling, because many of the cases where Johnson & Johnson would make the most sense are going to be with populations that are hardest to reach.
Yeah. Well, also a lot of universities were counting on Johnson, or still are counting.
That's right.
And I suspect they will still continue to go forward with using Johnson & Johnson, although they're saying that they prefer for younger people to get the other vaccines. So for example, here in where I live, we're ready to, well, actually the national, they want us to shift to 16 and older. But they want to make sure the younger people get the Pfizer or Moderna and not the Johnson & Johnson. So that's a big, so that's going to be an issue for higher ed and institutions that were counting on Johnson & Johnson.
There are also a lot of conversations around requiring, is it okay to require the students to be vaccinated?
Exactly.
And what about the employees, especially where, these vaccinations were approved under duress? Like, these are the emergency approvals. They haven't gone through, the full regular slate of approval and testing and whatnot. So a lot of resistance to requiring it of employees, because, people can still work and whatnot. So there are a lot of complicated conversations and a lot of viewpoints worth listening to and digging into to figure out what's going to work for each institution.
Right. But every day there's new institutions saying that they're going to start requiring students to have the vaccine to enroll in the fall. And this is not new. It's so funny. People are complaining about, vaccine passports and all. It's like, when I was at UCLA in the 90s, I had to get my vaccines up to date. And actually, it was a requirement for me to enroll. And same thing at University of Texas at Austin, when I was a staff person or a faculty member, I had to have all my vaccines up to date. And there's a good reason for that, right? Because it's so funny, when people ask me, I say, basically, I work on a campus full of vectors, meaning, kids who are carrying all kinds of diseases. Because I remember I was in a airport probably a little over a year ago, because it was before and I was, sitting there doing my usual 20 seconds washing my hands. And so I was, somebody's like, oh, are you a nurse or something? No, I work on college campuses. So I'm around all these disease vectors. and plus, if you have kids if you have kids, period. I just remember when we first put my son in daycare, my older son in daycare, it was just, he would just bring stuff home. I mean, we'd all get sick, and the first year of daycare, you just assume you're going to be sick most of the time, and your child's going to be sick most of the time. And then you get through it, and then, I
considered that, like, okay, let's take my immune system to the gym. As I send my kiddo to daycare, we're going to see what I can create over the next year.
Yeah. Although I think Deb mentioned a really interesting point there as well. When you go for your vaccine, because I'm halfway into my Pfizer regime so far, but signing the emergency use authorization paperwork is a reminder that science is still in flight on these things. And I could see more of a case to opt out in a genuine way, depending on how you're thinking about risk and the way you're thinking about this stuff. I understand the responsibility that a lot of us have to encourage everyone to opt in. But it is a little different from like mumps, measles, rubella vaccine, or some of the other vaccines that are now, there have been so many millions of clinical trials and real trials so that everyone knows the actual efficacy and they understand the full extent of the side effects. Because even now, we don't know. I think the CDC was just saying it could go, it looks like Pfizer and Moderna are good for 9 months, I think was the latest we heard. And that's because those most advanced trials are the furthest out that we actually have any of the science for. So, I thought that was a really good point. And it is a reminder of your other point, Deb, that like we've all had to ramp up our understanding of epidemiology. But then when you actually get to the point of being vaccinated, like you're not really reading the fine print. Like I went to the
here you go.
I went to the Walgreens. They bait and jab me. I signed up for Moderna, and they were like, "Oh, sorry, we're out of Moderna. We only have Pfizer." And I was like, "Okay, like what was I?
What are you
I
gonna
guess
do?
I could have walked out, like, and that's where like, on the one hand, I do think about like the patient's bill of rights, and like any of us has a right to our own just healthcare decisions at any point along the line, but it does feel like it's almost like a wartime footing where like this is an act of civic responsibility to a certain extent, more so than just an act of, what should I do for my personal health and well-being.
And I think that's another place where trying to predict my emotional reaction, I was like, oh, I'll be happy. But I had tears welling up. It just felt like this relief and this sense of community. Like I was locking eyes with the woman across, getting the shot at the same time. It was like this bonding moment. And, there's something communal and real and just raw about all of this.
Mm-hmm.
But, just being out walking this morning and seeing people, they're older and it's like, I'm sure they're vaccinated. It's like, we're all smiling and saying hi to each other. And it's like, yes, we're vaccinated. Right. But, so Mike, I'm going to pivot here because I'm dying to talk to Debra. I shouldn't say that word dying, but anyway, to Debra about, this institutional collaborations, because Debra, you saw my article I'd written on LinkedIn, and actually my friend Gary Stalker and I have been talking about this for a long time. And, I always use the Claremont schools as one of my examples of a very successful, basically a collaboration across 5 institutions. And that's what Gary always says, 5 to 10 institutions should get together and, share resources and all of that. And so I'm really curious, what just made you decide to go into this after having been at Claremont, and what are you up to these days?
Yeah. So, my origin story here is that I'm trained as a close relationships researcher. So my favorite classes to teach at Harvey Mudd were the psychology of close relationships. And my tagline was hooking up, breaking up, and everything in between. And then moving that into the psychology of community building, and then moving it into the psychology of collaboration. But it's all about the relationships between individuals or entities and what it means to be separate together, that we all have our, in our romantic relationships and our parent-child relationships, that we have this entity that is the me and the them, but there's also this sense of we-ness. And realizing that a lot of the theoretical frameworks that I was bringing to the romantic relationship work ended up translating beautifully when it came time to help thinking about how institutions can play better together. And Terri, the Claremonts are often held up as like, hey, they're doing it great. They have a huge, the Claremont College's services, a whole bunch of people working behind the scenes to help make some of these collaborations possible. And even within that context, it is hard work. And that to me is where, I put my scholarship hat on, is like, how can we smooth this out? How can we make this more available? Because, when you think through like, why should institutions collaborate in general, my attitude here is, you do together that which doesn't differentiate the institution. So does anyone, really care where you buy your office supplies from, or could we just join forces, get some economy of scale there, but also do together that which will be more magnificent than what any of you could do alone. Mm-hmm. And those 2 principles, guide a lot of the way I approach this work.
Yeah. And one of the questions in the chat is this, how do we, do this kind of collaboration? And, does it make, so for example, in the social justice issues and the pandemic, did it help the Claremont schools, the fact that they could work together and, develop their strategies to deal with both, the social justice issues, but also the pandemic, or does it make the response less agile?
Yeah. So and I've talked to a lot of consortia leaders from other consortia as well. And here's what I'm hearing, that those who have worked together before, who already had established relationships, established trust, established communication channels, they were able to pivot really quickly. In part, everyone had to figure out how to use Zoom, and then that actually people started to meet more frequently than they had prior. So where, some of these consortia, so Claremont's really bizarre in that it's really that square mile, but a lot of consortia in higher ed are geographically very distributed. So some are nationwide, and then you'll end up these regional ones, like the New York Six. They're all small liberal arts schools in upstate New York, but they're still, it's about 4 hours stem to stern if you were to commute. And the practice previously was, get together a couple times a year and everyone would make the drive. But now everyone's facing shared challenges, trying to figure out what the heck to do. There's a new tool, this Zoom thing. Oh my gosh, this is actually working okay. And they were able to move into new habits of being and doing together really very smoothly. I talked to Amy Cronin just earlier today, actually, and she was sharing some of the ways that new groups are forming, or people who hadn't normally or hadn't been meeting together are now meeting together. Really cool stuff.
Yeah.
Very cool.
And there are probably universal truths about how humans connect to each other, build close relationships, build cultures, tribes, collaborations. What are there some examples? You were talking about how you liked analogies, like kind of analogizing to other ways in which relationships can work well, can work badly. Are there ways that you can identify good opportunities for collaboration versus there are some cases where collaboration probably doesn't make sense? So I was wondering, based on actually both your experiences, but particularly you, Deb, just because I think you live and breathe this stuff. What are the characteristics that signal this is a good opportunity, maybe lean into the collaboration? And then what are some of the warning signs, signposts that say, the amount of effort you'd have to put in to try to build this partnership? I mean, are there some cases like that as well?
Absolutely. So collaboration is a tool, and it's not a tool that's going to solve every problem. It's not the right tool for the job all the time. And looking at things, when you have a prospective collaborative partner, and you're like, gosh, kind of like if you're on online dating, like, do I want to pursue this or not? But looking, are their values aligned here? It's not that we need to want or like all the same outcomes across the board for all things, but is there enough of a shared interest that this outcome indeed serves the respective interest and needs of all potential collaborators? That super important. And in order to have that understanding, you have to be able to communicate honestly about what your needs and interests are. So if you are like, we have got to have, a diversity training program with these features, and those particular features are like, I'm not sure if that's what we want. You have to communicate that so that you can find the alignment, so that you can then do the intensive project management, the intensive really defining what that collaboration looks like to move forward. The red flags are things like if someone suddenly stops asking about your needs and interests, or how is this going for you? If they start strong arming decisions, if decisions start being made in back rooms where you're not actually part of the conversation. Same things like frankly in a dyadic relationship. So if someone's making all the decisions and being bossy boss, not necessarily the best dynamic for longevity and well-being.
I think that's one of the tough things about collaborations is like, especially when you're dealing with university presidents or college presidents, and, they're used to being the top dog, and, it's like, how do you get them to really agree to, be collaborative?
Yeah. And I was just going to say, part of it is really, what are you interested in? Like, what makes this valuable to you? And having those established relationships where we've practiced being and doing together before is so incredibly helpful to help leave the egos and the logos at the door, I like to say, you know, that
I love that phrase.
Yeah, and also being able to trust that, you know, Terry, you and I are going to have this conversation. We're gonna show our real stuff, and you're not going to go blab it to other people. Like there's trust
Yeah,
building up
that's
there,
huge.
too, and how we relate.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it reminds me a bit about professional mediators and arbitrators, where there are actually a set of skills. Same thing with counselors, psychologists, group therapy folks. There is a process that frequently benefits from someone from the outside facilitating it. So that's another element of this that I think it would be interesting for both of you to expand on, because it sounds like you've both been in this space working with higher ed, maybe more than one institution at the same time. Frequently having a third party or a disinterested, UN observer can really help with the conflict avoidance at the top too, so that you don't accidentally stumble into something that really would be more about miscommunication, but then also conflict resolution. Because I think there's a point where a professional from the outside, a consultant, a therapist, a guide, can frequently build the safety so that you can actually go after the conflicts and resolve them, because a less mature relationship frequently avoids all that and just wants to kind of surf on, we're good, okay, cool. And frequently you need somebody from the outside to kind of make it safe to begin with, but then once it's safe enough, then to actually do emotional work. And lots of times people don't want to do that type of work.
Yeah. So that neutral outside facilitator, that's what I do. And Terry, I'm excited to hear your thoughts on this too. And even if you have someone who has the right skill set and inclination on the inside, the perception will be that they're coming at it from a biased lens, or they might actually be making decisions and assumptions based on their internal knowledge that doesn't actually translate to the other institution. So I totally agree with this idea of having that third party who holds the outcome, who holds the collaboration as the goal, as the sturdy container for that to happen. And then this idea of conflict, I think it's actually a really good thing when it kicks up, because it says that the people in the room care enough to actually be there, that they're engaged, that they're trying to figure it out, that there's something at stake, that this thing really matters. And then finding a way to navigate that with grace and, honoring those individual needs and interests, but also continuing to see, does it still feel right to push toward this goal? And, again, what's at stake here?
Yeah. And, I was just going to comment on the fact that it requires being able to manage vulnerability, because, these people are walking into a room, because, obviously the issue we're dealing with for a lot of these institutions, especially the smaller privates, is this idea of, are we going to survive? How are we going to make it through with all this upheaval and all the costs they've had to take on in the last year? And so, there's a lot of vulnerability out there. And, for example, here we just saw Mills College make the decision that they're not going to have undergraduates anymore in the fall. And, they're basically shifting focus. I mean, it's interesting because they have a large enough endowment to continue doing something. They just don't have a large enough endowment to continue bleeding money and funds as an undergraduate institution.
And I think this is a great time to bring up the recently announced the Transformational Partnerships Fund. So it's a philanthropic endeavor that's going to help resource institutions who are interested in exploring the possibilities of doing something together. And that something might be this big dramatic merger, but there are so many ways of partnering and doing together that fall much less severe than a merger, where it might be shared academic programs or shared back office support. And so, but it can be so risky. So this point of managing the vulnerability, Terry, just really resonates with me. It can be really risky if anyone in your community even hears that there's a conversation happening like this. One of the things I'm totally jazzed about with this Transformational Partnership Fund is that they're saying we can come in and help you or support this confidentially, quietly, help you figure out some of the steps to make it possible just to explore without commitment, without downwind consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And who's, I haven't heard of this before. Who's sponsoring this?
So the lead, as I understand it, the lead on it is Sea Change Partners, but they're doing it in collaboration with a lot of other funders, including, I haven't written down here, ECMC Foundation.
Oh, yeah.
And then additional support from Ascendium Education
Mhm.
Group and Kesky Foundation.
Hmm.
And they're particularly interested, they on their website, they have these so tying back into the diversity and equity question, the stats that they're representing here are that 12% of all students currently are enrolled in colleges that are at risk. And 19% of all Black students are currently enrolled at colleges that are at risk. So, the students we most need to help or support, create equitable spaces for, are at these institutions that really need to be thinking about how they're going to thrive, survive, make it through the vulnerabilities here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know that some of the HBCUs have been kind of looking at these things, although they just got yet another bailout. So they'll be doing a lot. I think a lot of their debt was just canceled, which was kind of through the federal government. So that's a very, very good thing. But I still think, in some ways, I wish we weren't looking at this in the context of crisis, right? Because what I would prefer is that we would say, what's the best format for us as, a liberal arts college? Should we be doing these shared things? And, and it shouldn't be, like I said, because we're worried about money. It should be because we want to do the thing that's best for the students.
Mm-hmm.
To actually advance these missions we care so much about. I was like, how many of these missions, if you look at them, the right answer is, what we should do? We should go behind closed walls, totally immure ourselves, and I don't think anyone actually thinks that or says that, but if you play with the extreme, it's like, why does that make sense? It doesn't.
Yeah. Well, I think it also, if you think about it from the perspective of the student or the learner, there is that sense of affiliating with, that's my school, that's my tribe. Getting back to the way we were thinking about it before, it's my I identify.
Identity, yeah.
Yeah. But at the same time, like if that identity could be broadened in some context, and that's where I'm really curious about what each of you might think about the role that this online transformation that we've seen might have on the ability for the student to cross honor for the universities to cross honor their programs. Like if you want to take a semester online was one program that was like this. I believe it's still in effect, but the idea that, the curriculum, that maybe their courses or programs that can only be offered at one of the Claremont McKenna schools, if you're trying to be student centric, can you enable ways for them to be a little more interchangeable, interoperable? Because it does feel like a natural extension of the race to Zoom that we've all seen, that we all know there are some components of programs that are no longer going to be limited by geography. So it does feel like, thinking about it from the learner's perspective, if you're going to a small private liberal arts college, they may not have everything that you want to study, but if there was more of an opportunity to pick up on some of the curricula from partner schools, that sounds like a winner. What am I missing as the guy who's not inside on higher ed? Like, why is it that they're concerned that those dynamics will become competitive and ultimately they'll lose? I'm just wondering why there aren't more, or is that something you're anticipating? Are we expecting there to be more of those types of partnerships emerging heading forward?
So there are a lot of those programs that exist already, where like the Texas Learning Consortium, for instance, where it doesn't make sense for 5 different schools to champion a German program or like that. But if a couple schools have a faculty member in German, it makes perfect sense to bring them together. So they do exist. My prediction is they're going to become more common. But there are concerns or drivers or things that are on the administrators' minds about enrollment numbers and butts and seats, and how do the different metrics that we use. And Terri, you can speak to this, more solidly than I can, coming from your really deep administrative background. But those things matter as metrics for decision-making for, resources.
Right. Well, and we haven't even raised the issue of accreditation. So you start talking data and, institutional research and all of that. And then my mind jumps immediately to accreditation issues. And so like the Texas Language Consortium, that's something that came about, I think, because of the declining resources for having all these, having all the same languages in one institution versus sharing across institutions. But the imperatives are hard to balance with the need to maintain certain requirements around accreditation. And so we need the accreditors to become more flexible and allow for more of this cross campus and in collaborations that can bring together different curriculum. I mean, we had started, when I was at Menlo College, we had started discussions around this whole idea of what if we worked with Palo Alto University on their psychology program and the Notre Dame de Namur. I mean, we had started kind of having those discussions, but we just ran into so many issues around how do you coordinate classes and this and that. And so, yeah, it's been interesting.
This brings up for me to the 2-year transfer in challenges. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's some similarities there, like even if you're within the same accrediting body, the idea that this one's called Psych 100 and over here it's Psych 1 and art is actually comparable. Right. How do you make those decisions? But ultimately you go back to this question of what's actually in the best interest of the students. Mm-hmm. Does it make sense that they have to navigate threads and threads of complexity, or is there a way we can make these pathways more visible and navigable?
Yeah, and also more on-ramps and off-ramps, so that if it makes sense to get in, get a certificate in a year, get out, get back in, get your associates, get back out again, get back in, and think about the full lifespan of your educational career, which for all of us is going to extend for our entire lives. If we want to stay relevant and employed, you have to keep learning. And then how much of that will be governed by this, the sheepskin at the end of a 4-year traditional higher ed experience. That's another one that I think is going to be more disrupted by the changes we've seen, even just economically. I think people are trying to understand where are the new jobs going to be, and then what's the fastest path to reskilling, upskilling to get certified as ready for those new jobs. And as someone, like I tend to look across not just higher ed, that's where I do think, what's happening in the professional development and in the private sector in terms of skills and certifications. Even, Terry, I know Brighter Higher Ed has been providing programs to train people on DEI, because you're not necessarily going to get that, which department in higher ed is going to be accredited to give you a bachelor's or an associate's or a master's degree in diversity, equity, inclusion. Probably no one, because they're not going to be able to move fast enough. So I'd be curious how the two of you see it playing forward too, in terms of who will are the universities just partnering with each other, or are there other types of relationships and partnerships and collaborations that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I would say the intersector collaborations are also really important. And one that's bubbling up, remembering this in my mind, is the Atlanta Consortium. Has 5 of the HBCUs in it. Mm-hmm. And one of their COVID collaborations was with the community doing workforce development, saying like, we got to figure out something. And so the 5 institutions were working on a piece, but it was in collaboration with the corporate sector. And so this idea that, we have obviously different resources available, similar needs, we can help each other out, but you got to have your head up to be able to see those and to be thinking outside the walls of your institution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then how much of an industry is there that, like, I don't want to blow up, either of yours respective spots, but it feels like there's going to be need within higher ed in particular to have groups like each of yours helping them navigate this. how do they find you, and how ready are they to do this type of outreach? Because it seems like it reminds me of some of the conversations I've had about, centers for teaching and learning. Like, it's almost like there's too much demand for the needs to respond to the state of affairs that we're in right now, which again is probably good for business, but it also could be overwhelming. So I'd be curious, like, how would you characterize the space that you're in, and like, how do you see it heading, in maybe the short and maybe a little longer term? Because I think we're going to start settling into something new and maybe a little bit different starting in the fall.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Deb.
Oh, so I was going to say that to me, the most important thing is that there are some established practices and approaches here. And so doing the professional development of reaching out, there are so many consortia, which is one model of doing together, but also a lot of really effective, inspiring cross-campus, cross-sector pieces. And I'll give a shout out here to this Association for Collaborative Leadership. This is like a group that gets together and figures out how to do this work well. And they're incredibly welcoming and collaborative, not surprisingly. And they're always happy to help people figure out the ropes or come up with some ideas or some models for doing, because I do think beyond this sense of, shared chaos in the world, but we are in this really nuanced academic environment where we're navigating shared governance and constrained resources and, shifting sands and uncertainty, that to be able to turn to others who are also navigating that and learn alongside them, but also contribute your talents and your skills to their successes. I see a lot of future here, which is, perhaps not surprising why I said, hey, I want to go be a part of this and contribute what I can.
Mm-hmm.
And, my perspective has been more kind of from as somebody who is a provost who is trying to do this kind of stuff and seeing that, I'm frustrated that institutions like Mills and Notre Dame de Namur here in the Bay Area are giving up instead of trying to find ways to move forward, that can continue their undergraduate programs. Because it's so funny, there's this really weird dynamic going on where there's more and more students who want to go to college. Really, we talk about this demographic cliff, but the UCs had they had a 30,000, they're already over 200,000 applications, and they have another 30,000, more than last year applying. And so I think that I just believe that there's more and more people who want to be educated,
Mm-hmm.
whether they're the typical 18-year-old or the 25-year-old who wants to start a new skill,
Right.
All of that. So I think that there's just so many opportunities out there. And really I'm a big fan of the smaller colleges, because I think they serve students from low income and first generation backgrounds very well. Not every student wants to go to the big university, and some are better off at a small private. And we need that kind of broad array of different kinds of institutions offering different kinds of programs. And so if we could find this, but I also having been a provost again, I find that we're not very collaborative in higher ed. We see each other as competitors. We see each other as fighting over the same set of students, and so it just causes us to be in a situation where we aren't necessarily doing our best to find new ways to come together.
Yeah. Well, it's almost like a game theory thing too. I think when people are in that fight or flight mode, everyone's protecting themselves. They're not comfortable being vulnerable, and they frequently can't get past that sort of initial state of distrust. And then if you compound that with the fact that some folks have been structurally in places that are not particularly accommodating, welcoming, they don't feel included, you could see how it gets tricky. And I'm fascinated by Deb is doing interesting work here, I believe, with her AV setup. Is that what's going on?
My very awesome 11-year-old, I just texted him on Discord. I'm like, my computer's about ready to die and the power cord's upstairs, so we've got it rigged up.
Nice.
I wanted to speak to, this competition thing. because it's super important. It's real. Of course, you have to look out for your individual institution's interest. And to me, one of the big insights here is, again, you don't have to do everything together. You find
That's
the
right.
things that make sense to align on and you pursue those.
Mhm.
And just because you say yes to option A or, collaboration A doesn't mean you have to now do the same things together all the time. You do what makes sense for your institution.
Mhm.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah. And I guess, we're getting close to winding up here. If I wanted to jump in and figure out, what's one thing that we could kind of do as a takeaway for people who are listening to this is, that it's really important to explore, right? I think that's what I would encourage people to do is don't people see higher ed as so hidebound and we're all about the status quo and we've always done it this way. I feel like I was so incredibly lucky to spend the last 3 years just kind of exploring the broader world of what's going on in terms of innovation and educational technology. And, we've talked a lot about, agile and taking an agile approach and all of that. I think what I would love to see more higher ed leaders do is to start exploring these things. Just take a little bit of time and look around you. Get your peek up over the the ivory tower, and start seeing what's going on. Because one of my biggest complaints as I've been out and about going in pre-COVID in the before times, going around to different conventions and conferences and now webinars is that there's so much going on out here. Mm-hmm. And there's so many exciting things. And I'm so excited to be getting back in the classroom and all these things I've learned about online and gamification and all that I'm going to bring into the classroom, right? And it's because I've spent the time over the last few years, and it doesn't, it's not, people, oh, I'm so busy. It's like, we can't afford to not be looking at what's going on in more broadly in higher education and really taking the time to explore and understand what are the various options and saying, just being willing to say, yeah, maybe we need to try something different. And so I guess that's the big takeaway I have.
I love that. And so the model that I work with at MICO, I call it the collaborative action model. And it starts with this notion of exploring that there's nothing wrong or risky with asking what if, imagine if. And to me, the other piece of advice is to have a real heart to heart with yourself about what is not just the return on investment. And I know we start thinking dollars and whatnot, but what's the cost of inaction? So if we don't do this, what are we leaving on the table for our institutions, for the students, for our communities? And then asking why now? Why is now the right time? Especially with all the, the pandemic and the racial injustice, where it feels this idea of the walls are caving in, and not necessarily wanting to react in crisis, because of course it makes sense that you want to kind of turn inward and be self-protective. But there's also evidence, at least in the corporate setting, that those corporations that reach out and are more collaborative during times of crisis, they fare better too. Mm-hmm. I mean, there is something self-protective about stepping outside of the zero-sum game thinking.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and there'll be more dollars coming into the higher ed space, it looks like, as well too. So I think the false scarcity is something I talk about a lot when I think about higher ed. A lot of it is positioned as a scarcity dynamic, which I somewhat for nefarious objectives at times. I think if you create that false scarcity, I think it allows you to get away with things that maybe otherwise you couldn't. And I think if you flip it sort of the way you were describing it, Terri, and you think about where is there actually an abundance of opportunity, I think it's frequently treating the people who are not actually served by higher ed today, the people who are being betrayed by it. Frankly, that's a huge population. And that's a big problem. And that problem doesn't end when someone's 24. Mm-hmm. Like you're setting them on a course that may not ultimately end up favorable to them. So I think almost like a reset around the mission around who these institutions serve is something that I think it's like almost a reckoning point on that front, where like if you don't know who you're serving and you don't have a mission in service of their outcomes, and maybe you're not thinking broadly about who they could be, there's a lot of danger out there. So, I do think folks will need to rely on trusted guides. I like to talk about Sherpas. You both seem like Sherpas, leading Sherpas in the space. But, it's nice that you're both out there helping folks figure it out. It's nice that we're here each Wednesday-ish, Terry, talking about it. Final concluding thoughts, bringing it home.
Well, I'll give Deb the chance to do her final concluding thoughts first.
Just that it's there really are so many possibilities here, and talk about an abundance. So higher ed is loaded with ideas, loaded with smart people with good hearts. And if ever there's a situation where we can do together and do well by our students and by our missions, it's in this space that we love and that we inhabit.
Absolutely. And I'm a big fan of higher ed, and I think it's important. I think we need to get, student success and student access is what I'm all about. And I really believe it's important for higher ed leaders to have that in front of them as they go forward, and remember that, this is our mission. It's funny, somebody was saying, student success, why is this new? It's what we're all about. So I'll end there.
Yeah.
All right. That was great. And then who pushes the button?
I'll push the button.
Nice. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.